Hello, everybody. I think we're ready to start the masterclass right here. The first thing that I want to check is the sound, the quality, and the volume of it. Can you hear me over there? Can you tell me if everything is heard properly? If yes, could you please tell me that you can hear me well? Let's just check the sound. I'm just waiting for your comments about the sound. If you can hear me, we will start. Well, I guess it's all good. So let's start now, and we're going to start the masterclass. I have prepared my presentation right here. This is the Ielts speaking course structure. This is the presentation for today. And these are the topics that we're going to talk about. The speaking test format itself, right? The scoring system in Ielts, part 1, part 2, and part 3 overview. And most importantly, the topics that you can have, the topics that you need to prepare for in the most hardworking way. Now, let's start from the first slide. I want to make sure that everybody understands what speaking is. First of all, not everybody understands that speaking has its own timing, basically, right? When you speak in part 1, you have 4 to 5 minutes to speak. So if you have short answers, it's too bad. And if you have the answers that are too long, it's bad either. That's why you need to have perfectly timed answers, 1 to 2 full sentences when you speak in a part 1, right? And you remember, probably you know that in the part 1, we're talking about familiar topics, right? Let's say questions like where you live, what do you do, what kind of hobbies do you have, where do you go to school, what kinds of subjects do you study? So familiar questions. And in this case, it wouldn't be a good idea to just say no and to just say yes. You should give me a full answer. For example, if the question is, what do you study? You should say, well, first of all, I have to tell you that I study in the secondary school here in Tashkent, and we have about 15 subjects per semester, for example, or per a quarter, right? Like we say in school. In this case, you have 1 full or 2 sentences, and you give some details, but also make sure that in part 1, you do not speak for too long, which would be a bad idea. I remember some students who spoke for a long time in part 1, and in part 3, right here, they're not given much time and many opportunities to speak. That's why timing is important, and it's about familiar questions, as I told you about. And then in the part 2, they have 3 to 4 minutes overall. Out of 3 to 4 in the speaking test format, 2 are for the answer itself, and you have 1 minute to prepare. And here you have something that is called a cue card. And the cue card is the question or the inquiry that is given to you, which asks you about a particular thing, particular person, particular situation, and so on. For example, describe your best friend, or describe the sports game that you saw on TV, or describe your favorite piece of clothing. And in this case, you have to speak about that one thing for 2 minutes, and you have 1 minute to prepare, basically. And then discussion part, the last one. Here you will receive a few questions. You will receive fewer questions than in the part 1, but here questions will be a bit more tougher, a bit much tougher, a bit more sophisticated, and they'll be more interesting than in part 1. That's the part that I like about part 3, because it's a discussion, So now that we know the format, and I think maybe you heard about it before, what's really important also is to know the criteria, how the speaking is judged. what we need to understand about it. So basically we have fluency and coherence right here. We have lexical resources, we have pronunciation, we have grammatical range and accuracy. Now in Uzbekistan, the most important, I'll be honest with you, the most important one, the most difficult one for many people, is grammatical range, which means it is about the grammar mostly. Because even if there is some fluency, which means the clarity of speech, how clear your speech is, right? Even if you're using different sorts of vocabulary, you have academic words, and even if your pronunciation is great, but your grammar is a bit weak, in this case, the overall score is also going to be affected. That's why first you need to have a grammatical base, and then one by one, you can improve everything else. But each of these criteria gives you 25% of the mark. And we remember that in Ielts, you have a 9-band scale, which means you can get anything from 0 to 9. Myself, I've gotten a 9 for speaking recently. That was in January 15th. My exam happened in ITP. I was very happy to receive that score, and I've been studying for a long time to receive that score. And you know, you can only receive a good score that you're hoping for only by understanding what is needed exactly from your exam. That's why understanding these features is really great, because some people in Uzbekistan, right, they think that pronunciation is not important, but it is. See, even if your fluency, lexical resource, and grammatical range are great, but if your pronunciation is, let's say, classic Uzbek or classic Russian pronunciation, when instead of saying the, you say ze, in this case, your score is going to be affected. That's why accents and dialects, they should be ignored, and you should try to speak in British, you know, accent. At least you should try, you know, or American accent. It doesn't have to be fake too much, right? You don't have to over exaggerate over there with the accent, but I think you should just try not to make mistakes. So you shouldn't say anything like mother or father, right? It's not accepted. You should say mother, father, brother, right? TH is used accordingly here in the appropriate way. So please make sure you understand all of the criteria here. And after that, I believe you will know how you can get the score desired, whether it's a 7, it's 8 or a 9. Now let's move on. Once again, let's talk about the structure itself and what happens, right? In part 1, as I told you, it lasts 4 to 5 minutes. In here, you can get a lot of questions, but it depends on how short or long your answers are. That's why I told you that timing is precise. If you are given a question, where do you study? Just tell me, where do you study, right? Just give me a full sentence or 2 sentences, but make sure you don't just say in Yunusabat, for example, right? If you study in Tashkent. Or don't also talk for 5 minutes about where you study, because you're wasting time. Anyway, the examiner will stop you. That's for sure if you speak for too long, but that's not a good sign anyway. That's why you have to time everything very well. Of course, when you come to the exam, right, you will be in a certain building, and when it's your turn, the examiner will say hi. They'll say hello. You should say hi as well. You know, you should smile and be presentable. And then the examiner introduces themselves to you. It can be a woman, it can be a man, okay? And they introduce themselves. And when you take a sit, they firstly will ask for your ID, which is the identification document, which is basically your passport. And you need to have the passport, and passport will be the only thing that you need to carry with yourself. No phones, no keys, no watches, no jewelry, nothing, only your ID. And then of course, the examiner will start recording the whole process, and they will start asking you questions about familiar topics. But sometimes these topics, even though they're familiar, they can be difficult as well. For example, there are questions in IELTS about flowers. How often do you buy flowers? For whom do you buy flowers? Do you think it's important to give flowers as a gift, for example, as a present for a birthday or any other occasion, situation? So it is familiar, but I believe the best preparation for part one is being able to answer to different questions, whether it's flowers, education, work, sport, music, movies, reading, writing, sleeping. Also, there are questions about sleeping. Some of you might not know that. That's why it's very important to be ready for different kinds of topics. And also, there are situations like in sleeping, right? Like when it comes to these topics, when a lot of students, they think that the question is too funny and they cannot answer in the proper way. For example, in the exam, you might be asked, how often do you sleep? Or how long do you sleep? How many hours do you sleep per day? And in this question, it might sound funny to you, but you should find a way to explain yourself in the most appropriate and academic way. And give an answer, for example, saying, well, you know, I sleep for about 5 hours a day. And I have been sleeping for 5 hours a day in the last 6 months because I am a student and I am a hardworking student. So, you know, it takes me a lot of time to finish my homework before going to sleep. And I have to wake up early in the morning to be ready for my university, for example. So in this case, you're giving 2 sentences, 1 to 2 sentences, right? And you're explaining everything that is needed. So the reason and why and how many hours, for example, you sleep. And you're doing that in a very simple yet academic and presentable way. That's why you should be ready for any kinds of questions, whether they're funny or not funny, serious or not serious. You should find a logical reasoning and explain yourself in the best way possible. Explaining yourself is really important in IELTS because why is the main question. So if somebody asks you, how long do you sleep, right? Or how many hours per day you sleep? And then you say 6 hours. Right, and then the examiner can ask you, why 6? Why not 7? Why not 8? You know, why is that so low? Why this number is so low, for example? So anyway, you should be always ready to to tell the examiner why that is happening. The question of why is really important now. So that's what you need to know. That's really important. In the second part, as I told you, you're only given 1 cue card. That's what we call it. I think maybe some of you know about that, right? And in this case, you have a minute to prepare with optional note-taking, which means you might have a pen. And if you want to, you can write something on the paper that's given to you. If you want to, you can just think for 1 minute and think, what am I going to say about this topic, right? So in this case, anyways, I think note-taking is a good option because you can write down 5 or 6 or maybe 10 words that are important to you. And when you're talking to the examiner face-to-face, when you're losing yourself, you can take a look on the paper, right? And look at some of the words that are your keywords, and then you can continue, which actually helps. So if, for example, the topic that is given to you in part 2 is, for example, let's say, describe a sports game that you saw on TV. In this case, your notes should be the most important words. For example, you can say, okay, football game. When did I watch it? For example, 2 years ago. At what time? In July. What was it? For example, a game between France and Croatia, right? So I write France, I write Croatia. That's the final of the World Cup, for example. I write World Cup as well. So now on the paper, I have July 2018, France, Croatia, World Cup. So if I have these 5 or 6 words for myself, just in case, that means that paper can be right here with me. And if I lose myself, I'll look at these words and they might save me. And just by looking at 1 word, I can open up and give full sentences. That's why note-taking is very important in this case. And please remember, some people say that you should speak for exactly 2 minutes in the second part. It's not fully true because according to multiple resources, it says for 1 to 2 minutes. But let me explain one important point. Some people speak fast. Some people do not speak fast, they speak slowly. So if you're giving me an answer, a good answer, in 1 minute and you speak very fast, that is a good sign. That is a good answer. But if you're speaking, for example, let's say very slow and still that's just for 1 minute, it's not acceptable. So that's why we should understand this rule properly. It says 1 to 2 minutes, but it's 1 minute only for people who can speak very fast and who can explain themselves very well. If you can't do that, then you should speak for 2 minutes, you know, and you should justify yourself and explain everything properly, smoothly, I would say. Then if you speak for more than 2 minutes, of course, the examiner might stop you. You know that because you still have the third part. And there are people waiting outside until you get out. That's why you only have 15 minutes, officially about 15 minutes on the exam. That's why timing, like I said, from the beginning on, is very important. You should know how long you should speak in every part. And then when you finish your answer, the examiner will assess and think about whether you gave enough or not. If your examiner thinks that you gave a good answer, they will just start part 3. If your examiner thinks that it was not enough, in this case, the examiner will ask something that's called follow-up questions, which sound like part 1 questions or part 3 questions, and you have to answer to them as well. In this case, follow-up questions will be related to your topic. For example, if the question was, describe a sports game that you saw, then the question follow-up might be, do you think it's important to broadcast, for example, sport on TV often, and so on. And then in the part 3, right here, we have 4 to 5 minutes to speak, and we're answering more sophisticated questions. Sophisticated, which means a bit more difficult. That's why if part 1 is about, for example, let's say, do you like sports? Then in the part 3, the question would be, what kind of sports have recently become popular in your country and why, for example? And then in what ways we can encourage children to, for example, like sports, right? Or follow sports or be active with sports. In this case, you have to give better reasons. And in this case, you have to have better linking words, I would say, to start your answer. For example, you can say, well, first of all, I would like to say that, you know, sport is very important. And recently in Uzbekistan, I think the sports of MMA, football, and basketball have become very, very popular. And the main reason is, and then you give the reason as well. So you see, firstly, I would like to say, well, the first reason, the second reason, I would also like to say, and finally. So if you can use your linking words in the proper way, then you can obviously give a great answer that has connection in between, which is going to be great. And then the questions that the examiner asks usually in part 3 are similar to part 2. So if you had questions about sport, if you had a cue card, about sport in part 2, in this case, you will have questions about sport, most probably in part 3 as well. That's why most of these moments are connected, and you should be expecting more questions about this topic. Now, this is it about the, let's say, the structure itself. Now, what I want to do, I want to open my Word file here, and I want to show you a few things. So let's make a quick summary. Well, so out of the things I said, I can make a summary that what's really important and what people do not often talk about in IELTS is the usage of linking words, what I would say is one of the most important things. And then, of course, it's going to be academic vocabulary. And then one more thing that I would like to tell you when you speak, that's maybe usually people don't say to you, that is specific vocabulary. I'm sorry for my slow typing. Specific vocabulary as well. So not everybody can do this, by the way. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody knows specific vocabulary for every topic. For example, if I'm talking about, let's say, movies, right? I'm talking about movies. And then somebody asks me a question, for example, describe your favorite movie or talk about your favorite movie, right? In this case, I'm going to choose the movie, and then I have to give proper reasons. For example, somebody asks, why did you like that movie? And in this question, if you're using words such as, for example, cast, then you have the word visual effects. And then you have the word soundtrack. And then, for example, you have the word, let's say, plot. What happens in the movie? That's the meaning of the word, right? And then the morale of the story, for example, the message, you can say. And then critical. Now, in this case, if I'm using words like this, when I am describing a favorite movie, I can get a great score. Cast is actors and actresses. So if I say, you know, I like this movie, first of all, because of the cast, what I'm saying is, I like that movie because of the actors and actresses. If I'm saying I like the movie because of visual effects, it means I like what I saw. Maybe there were some explosions inside, you know, maybe they used the camera in the best way possible. They're showing me the space, for example, with different effects. All of those are visual effects. So if I like that, it's a great reason for me to watch the movie. The soundtrack is the music that is being played. Soundtrack is the music that is being played in the background. So you're watching the movie and in the background, the music is playing. And sometimes you like that music more than the movie itself. And that's a great reason to like the movie. And sometimes if somebody asks you, you know, like, did you watch this movie? And sometimes you might say, no, I don't remember. But then they might ask, but do you remember the song from the movie? That was the soundtrack. And then you say yes sometimes, which means that music is sometimes more memorable than the movie itself. So if you use that word, that's going to be special. Plot, what happens in the movie, for example, right? The scenario, the story itself. Morale and message, the message of the movie, what it taught you. What do you know after watching this movie? So if the movie was about, for example, friendship, right? The message was being a loyal friend, for example, and that's why you like that movie, right? For example. And then critical reception is a great word that I would use in this case, which is about the reception, the opinion of the critics, people who judge movies, people who critique movies, some journalists who give ratings to movies. If you go to websites about movies, you can see stars, 5-star rating, for example, 4 stars out of 5, 3 out of 5, which means people are giving ratings to the movie. But there are also critics who give those ratings, people who analyze the movie. So if they have a positive reception, you can say, I like this movie because it was critically acclaimed. It was positively received by critics. So that is a great reason, and that is a very good usage of vocabulary. So again, I want to sum up by saying that linking words are really important, saying, well, first of all, on the one hand, on the other hand, right? And then academic vocabulary, as usual, always, no slang, right? And then we have the specific vocabulary like I used here. And for every topic, there will be specific vocabulary that you have to use. for each of them. You have to be able to use that. So if it's the movies, there's vocabulary like this. If it's sports, there's vocabulary for sports. If it's, I don't know, reading books, there is vocabulary for reading books. And for each of them, if you know specific words like this, like these words, I'm sorry, it's always going to be easier for you to talk, and you will always know what to say. These, I believe, are mostly what's forgotten, you know, especially specific vocabulary is something that people are not paying attention to nowadays because they speak academically, they speak well, but in order to get 8 and 8.5 and 9 in speaking, I believe you always have to know specific vocabulary and always know how to use that properly. That's always something that's very, very important, along with fluency and, you know, grammar and pronunciation and all of that. Now, this is what I wanted to tell you because these topics, you know, these criteria is something that's something that's usually forgotten. That's why I can finish it right here, I guess. And now, if you have any questions about anything I said, about the speaking itself, right? If you have any questions about the exam, if you have any question that you don't understand, you can give me some questions. I'll be waiting for you. I'm checking on my phone right now, checking on your questions. So if you're ready, you can give me any questions. Anybody? I am happy if everything was clear, but if you have questions, I am right here to answer them. Okay, while people are asking questions, I would also like to tell you that we appreciate the feedback. So if you like the video, you can like it and, you know, comment on it or share later on. If you dislike the video, you can tell us why. I did my best trying to explain the points that I think are important. Still waiting for questions if there are any. Guys, come on, don't be shy. Let's ask questions. Oh, okay. I see the questions now. I'm sorry. I just saw them. Okay. So let's choose one of the questions here. Is it useful to use special tips? For example, I guess I could begin by saying something about. Yes, it is a good idea to use, this is a linking word. This is not a tip. This is a linking phrase. Aziz John Gafurjonov, I'm answering your question. So if you're saying, I guess I could begin by, it's great to use that, but please do not use that too often. You should use different linking words. So one time you can say, firstly, I would like to say that. And then you can say, honestly, I think I would like to admit. So if you're using different linking words, it's definitely okay. Mm-hmm. Then, Hasanbek, specific vocabulary can be found online and in books as well. There are special books that are divided by topics. Okay, and you can find them in internet as well. For example, if you're talking about movies, you can type in Google asking specific vocabulary for movies. It's going to be absolutely free, and you can learn the needed words from there, for example. What will I do to stop speaking with accent? That's Rachel Lee. Well, if you want to get rid of accent, I think the best option is to speak to a native speaker. So if you can find friends in Instagram, for example, or in, I don't know, Telegram, right? And those friends can be from Australia or UK, and you can talk to them, you will feel that effect and you will try to speak like them. You will try to imitate them. Or, Rachel, I would like to tell you that it would be useful for you to watch movies and listen to music. And when you listen to music, to American music, for example, you can basically imitate what you hear. So if somebody sings, sing along with them and try to repeat the things exactly the same way they said. In this case, you will imitate them and try to speak like them, and over time, it will help you, I hope. Okay, and Hassanbek, you have one more question as I see. Is it useful to repeat after native speakers via videos to improve our speaking? Well, you can imitate them, Hassanbek, you can imitate them, but make sure that it sounds natural, you know, and don't repeat the same phrase over and over again. But you can definitely learn from them. It's not a big issue, you know. That's why we have these videos to watch and learn from them. So that's totally okay, I believe. Okay, what else? What else? Rosinisa Saidova, my speaking score is 9. My speaking score is a 9. Okay. I answered your question. All right. Any more questions, guys? If not, I'm going to stop. If there are no more questions. I answered about specific vocabulary, about pronunciation, about the score itself. Aziz Jan says the book 101 collocations by topics is very useful. Okay, okay, that's a good advice. Thank you, Aziz Jan. All right. If there are any more questions, hold on a second. Let me check more questions here. Which book is the best for improving vocabulary? Sometimes you don't even need books. Sometimes you can just use internet, right? But books, I would say, it's, academic vocabulary for Ielts. There was a book like that. That must be useful. And then Abdullah says we must use academic words in Ielts, and after that speak how it gives our result. Well, if you learn academic words, Abdullah, and if you use them properly, it will give you some results, you know, because Ielts is academic. You cannot use slang, you cannot use street words. That's why you should learn academic words. I hope I understood your question properly. Okay, guys, if there are no more, I'm just checking on more questions. I cannot see more questions. Well, in this case, I want to say thank you to everybody. If you liked this video, make sure you give us feedback. And if you liked it, we can actually continue. Okay, and if we can have another webinar on these topics. And if you have any ideas about specific topics that you would like to have webinars about, please provide us your feedback. And okay, one last question. Hassanbek says, which is more important, vocabulary or fluency? Hassanbek, I would say fluency is a bit more important, because sometimes you can speak in a simple way, but that will sound just amazing, and it will sound, you know, just like as if you are from America or from United States or from UK, for example. But anyways, having some specific vocabulary would be also good. That's why I'm using it, you know. And I'm saying that because if you want to get a 9, if you want to get 8.5 or 8, you have to have some specific words in your speech related to the topic. Okay, guys, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, at least in my phone. Please provide feedback later on. Thank you very much, and we will probably have another webinar soon. Thank you very much. I'm going to finish this webinar